about Docker Compose. Right. Before we talk about Docker Compose, let me introduce myself. My name is Amit. I am based out of Bangalore, and I've been in the industry for around 18 years now. And I've been working most of my life on DevOps and related technologies. So starting from version control system, the Linux administration, Kubernetes clusters, Jenkins, GitLab CI, GitHub Actions, AWS, Azure. So yeah, everything around DevOps, right? Puppet, Ansible, everything. So today we are here to have a brief introduction on Docker Compose, right? So we already have had some sessions um, on Docker and Docker CLI, right? So Docker as individual tool and technology. But let's talk about Docker Compose. Okay. So we are going to talk about it for like next 40 minutes. And after that, I'm going to have some Q&A and we will close by 4 o'clock. Right. Cool. Okay. So what is Docker? I think most of you would already know what is Docker. And also you should know what is Docker because this is the prerequisite for learning Docker Compose. So Docker is a technology which allows the vendors or developers of a tool or an application to create a package which is called as a Docker image, which contains the application which the vendor is developing, along with all the dependencies and the libraries that are required by this application to execute, right? Now, once this image is created, it's a complete standalone executable entity. So any customer who wants to use this application, let's say this is a customer server, right? They can download or pull this image to their local system and then execute the application from this image, right? They can execute the application from this image. Okay. So they don't need to set up any configurations on the server, any environment on the server. Just download the image. Image comes along with application. Image brings the dependencies, the libraries, and that gets executed. And the application starts running. And the end users can access the application on a port. If it is a web application, so they can access the application on the port, right? So this is what a Docker image is, and this is how you deploy applications running on Docker image. Now, why do you want to know? Why do you want to learn Docker Compose? So many times, so applications are not just one binary, right? Monolithic applications, like traditional applications, used to be a single binary, a big 500 MB or 1 GB application, which when you double click or when you run java-jar, the application name, it brings up the application. Everything is within the application, the database, the data store, the data cache, the presentation layer, the view model controller and all that stuff, right? So all used to be within a single monolithic application. But times have changed now. Now we have services and n-tier architecture, right? So microservices are still something new, which organizations are still adopting. They come with their own complexities. But an n-tier architecture is something which is now already well used. So what is an n-tier architecture? So n-tier architecture means the service or any application is divided into some broad components, right? For example, there could be a database which stores the data of an application. There could be a middleware which reads the data and then makes the data available to the front end. Right? And the end users can access the application which is on the front end. Right? So the typical communication goes like this. The end user talks to the front end. The front end wants to display some data. For example, let's say this is a banking application, right? It's too simple to be a banking application, but let's assume this is a banking application. So a user would log in to their banking interface. Let's say Citibank. So they give the username and password on the Citibank website. That's the front end, right? What you see on the browser. Then from the front end, the request will go to the middleware. The request will be like, hey, here is the user ID. Here is the password. Authenticate it and get me the data about this user. Now, this authentication will happen in the middleware by checking the user ID and the password within the database. Once the authentication is done, the middleware is also going to get the account summary and the loan accounts and credit cards, all those details from the database, and then give the results to the front end. Front end is going to display the entire results, and the end user sees that result. Right? So an application has multiple layers. There could be multiple middle layers talking to multitude of databases. Right? There could be multiple layers of front end. One front end, behind that, there could be multiple front ends. So applications are generally comprised of multiple tier of application components. Okay. Now, let's say we want to deploy this using Docker. So there will be a Docker image for the front end, right? Let's say, let's not give it like this. So let's say if this application is deployed using Docker, so there will be a front end image for Docker for the front end, a middleware image containing all the code for the middleware, and a database image, right? And using the front-end image, this container is executed. Using the middleware image, this container is executed. Using the DB image, this container is executed. Works fine, right? But then how do you ensure that you can manage this entire application stack? This entire application stack as a single entity. Now, these are three different containers. Let me just finish coloring it. All right. So there are three different containers. If you want to say that, hey, bring up my application, you are essentially doing an activity of bringing up the database first manually, then bringing up the middleware first manually, then bringing up the front end first manually, right? Is there a way that you can manage this entire application as a single entity? You can just say Citibank up, and then all the components of the Citibank applications are brought up. And you can see here, there are some interdependencies also, right? So for example, the middleware is dependent on the database. The middleware is dependent on the database. So unless the database is running, the middleware cannot function. So the database has to come up as the first component. And after that, middleware has to boot up. And then only the front end can talk to the middleware. And then only your application is up. So you need to bring up these containers with a single command and in a defined sequence. You also have to enable these components to talk to each other. So front end should know on which port the middleware runs. Middleware should know on which port the database runs, and what is the database username, what is the database password, and things like that. So how do you manage all these configurations, dependencies, and these containers as a single unit and bring it up or bring it down on the demand. The benefit of doing it in this way is if there are multiple teams working on this product, they don't have to remember the commands to bring up these applications one by one with the defined configurations. They can just run one command and bring up the entire stack. Or the testing team, if they are testing this, they can just bring up this entire application stack with one command rather than remembering all the configurations, right? So to solve this problem, to manage an multi-tier application as a single component, we have something called as Docker Compose. Docker Compose. So Docker Compose is a second party utility, or I would say first party utility, which is developed by Docker. It is not installed by default when you install Docker, so you have to install it separately. But this allows you, so let's say you have the Docker Compose, it allows you to feed a configuration file, a compose file, right? So you write a compose file in which you define what are the various containers you want to bring up, what is their configurations and things like that, and feed it to Compose. And Compose is going to read this configuration file and bring up all your services like your database, your middleware, your front end in the defined sequence with the correct configuration. Okay. And with the Docker Compose, you can feed this file and say destroy or bring down the entire application stack. And it's going to bring down all the containers which are part of the stack. Right. Let me show you a quick demo and then things will be a bit more clear. Okay. So for the demo, I have already created an instance. And let's connect to that instance. Is my terminal visible to everyone? Yeah, all right. So I'm going to connect to an instance which is on this IP address. Yeah. So this is a machine, right? This is a machine which I have. It is on AWS. I just created it for our example. So I have this machine here, and let's become root, right? And first thing is let's install Docker on it, right? So I do apt update, and to install Docker, I can follow a Docker guide, Docker installation guide. This is a guide to install Docker. It's pretty straightforward by using the app repository. Yeah, these are the commands I need to run, right? So I copy the commands and I try to execute them. So done, this is done. Then let's install the Docker packages. Okay, done. Now, Docker is installed. If I run just Docker, it's going to give me some output, so which means Docker is installed properly. Now, let's say for a very concrete example, let's say we want to bring up a WordPress application. Okay, there is an application called WordPress, which allows you to create your websites. Yeah. Let's say we want to deploy a WordPress application. This application has two components. Right? For simplicity, I have chosen this example because it has just two components. There is a database component and there is a WordPress itself. Okay. Now, both these components are available as Docker images. So for the database, we can use MySQL as the database. And on Docker Hub, we have the MySQL Docker image. For WordPress, we can use the WordPress Docker image. And on Docker Hub, it's available as a Docker image. So I can manually do a Docker run and get this database container running from the MySQL image. I can manually do a Docker run and get the WordPress container running from the WordPress image. But I don't want to do that. I want to use a Docker Compose file with Docker Compose to bring up this complete application stack. Okay, so I'm going to write a configuration file to bring up the database container, bring up the WordPress container. Also, in the database container, we are going to define the database, the username, the password, and also going to on the WordPress, going to define the database name, username, password, and ports and things like that. Right? So let's take a look at the example for that. Just give me 1 second. I need to pull up my notes. All right. So let's write Docker Compose file. Yeah. First of all, we have to see if Docker Compose is available. So I need to run a command called docker-compose. Unfortunately, it doesn't come by default installed with Docker, but it is straightforward. I can install it just like this. Apt install docker-compose. Press enter. It asks for confirmation, and very soon we should have it. So Docker Compose is now installed. Just give me 1 minute, guys. Okay, so Docker Compose is now installed. Docker Compose. If I run this, I will get some output. That means Docker Compose is installed. Now let's write a compose YAML file. Docker compose.yaml. Okay. This name is important, but doesn't mean that we need to give the file this exact name. But this name is important. I'll tell you later why. So it's a YAML format file, and you can write your entire Docker Compose instructions or configurations in this file. Okay. So let's say first is version. Now, this version is about the syntactical version that is accepted in Docker Compose, right? So you can write Docker Compose YAML file, but there could be some keywords that we are using which are not compatible with certain version of Docker, right? So with this version, we specify which version of Docker Compose YAML format we want to use, okay? So there are various versions. I can show you maybe here. Docker Compose version. Yeah. So you can see here, there are these versions, and these versions are compatible with specific versions of Docker. So version 2.3 is compatible with 17.06.0, and version 3.0 is compatible with 1.13.0 plus, and 3.8 is compatible with 19.03.0 plus. All right, just give me 1 second. Sorry about this break. So what I do is generally I just end up using 3.0, right? I end up using 3.0, which is has been my experience. And this will work on all the Docker versions 1.13 and above, right? So I just use it. You can use any version compared to based on what Docker you are using. Okay. All right. So I'm going to use 3.0. So let's come back here. I'll say 3.0, right? Then I need to specify which containers I want to bring up. So in the Docker world, when you talk about Docker Compose or Docker Swarm, containers are called services, right? Because these are the individual services of a bigger application. So I'll say I want to have these services. I want to bring up these particular services. Okay. All right. Which services? There is a service which I call as front end, which is going to be my WordPress, right? And there's going to be a service called backend, which will be my database application. Right? So I need to bring two services. Now let's give configurations for that. First is, which image do I want to use for this application? Which image? I want to use WordPress image. That's it. I can say WordPress latest or some other tag, but I want to use WordPress. I'll just remove the latest. It's going to pick up the latest one. I use this. And for backend, I want to use MySQL image. MySQL, right? The latest version is fine. Then I want this WordPress application to be available to external users. Now, by default, when you run containers in Docker, those applications running inside those containers are not accessible by external users. If you want them to be accessible by external users, you have to publish the ports, specific ports. So let's define the ports we want to publish. So for WordPress, we want to publish the port 2200. So WordPress runs on port 2200 and we want to publish it on port 80. Right? And there you go. That's it. Now, the database. Now, when you run a database containers or database applications, since the containers are supposed to be stateless and you are not supposed to interact within the containers, the MySQL container images or other database images, they require you to provide information about the default user, the default password, and the default database that should be created within this container. So when this container boots up, it is going to create a database for you with a default user and a default password. So it expects you to provide that information. And how do you provide that information? You provide that information using environment variables. So I say I will define some environment variables. And those variables are like this. I'll just copy from my notes and paste them here. Right. Like this. So I say set up these environment variables and put it inside this particular container. Now, when this container will start, it's going to take this information from the environment variables and use it to create the default database. So it's going to create a database of the name WordPress DB, and it's going to give the permission to the user, WordPress user, with a password WordPress underscore pass. It's also going to create the default root password, which is password. Okay. Now, the front-end service, which is the WordPress, it also has to talk to the MySQL service and the database running inside it. Right? So first thing is we need to tell the WordPress application where is the database and how to access it. Now, how do I give the information? Using environment variables. So I am just going to define an environment block here. And then I say, well, I also copied that from my notes. So the environment variables for this container, for this service, front-end service are set like this. WordPress DB host. Where is the database host? It's on the backend service. You see this backend service? This is the database host. All right. Where is the data? What is the database user? Is this one. So WordPress user. What is the database password? Is this one. And what is the database name? It's WordPress DB. So all the configurations are in now. Okay. Now, one thing that we need to take care of is the backend service should boot up before the front-end service. Right? That means the front-end service is dependent on the backend service. So we can add one more configuration called as depends on. So this particular service depends on, and then I can give a list of services that it depends on. So it depends on backend, right? So this service depends on backend. And that's it. If there is something else that I need to provide, I can add it here. But for now, this looks complete, right? I save this. And now I can say Docker compose up. If I run the command Docker compose up, Docker compose is going to look for a file with the name docker-compose.yaml. This is the default file that Docker compose looks for. So when I say Docker compose up, it's going to look for this file. And in our example, it's going to find this file and read all the configurations from the file and then bring up our application. So let's do that. It finds that it has to create two services. So first is the MySQL service, because the front end is dependent on MySQL. So it works on the MySQL service first. And you can see the containers are coming up. You can see all the backend, the logs from the backend, the front end logs, all of them are coming up now. And now, if I go to my browser and just go to this IP address on 2200, I think, you can see we get the WordPress interface. Why did I browse to port 2200? Because in my configuration file, I had defined that the port 80 of that container, which is running WordPress, should be exposed on port 2200 on the host. So I'm browsing it here. And I see all the options here. So I can, give any details. Is and it's going to deploy WordPress inside the container, and it is done. And you have your WordPress, right? So you have the WordPress application, and it was brought up by Docker Compose. Now this is the live running log and access for the complete application. If I just press Control C, yeah, it aborted all the containers. And now my application is gone. I can't access it anymore. Right? And just like that, if I want to bring the application again, I'll just run the command Docker compose up. Everything will be brought up. If I don't want to see this log and be stuck with the terminal being hijacked by these logs, I can bring up in detached mode. So I can say run in daemon mode, bring it in the background, press enter and done, right? And I can access the application again, hopefully. 2200. Here is my WordPress, right? I can log in. I am still logged in and I can do whatever I want. So that means my data was also persistent in the database. So this is how you can deploy applications with using just one command if you write your configuration file properly. And these configuration files, you can then, let's go back here. This configuration file can be also version controlled in Git. So you can keep a track of how the application deployment is evolving. You can give access to other users. So the other users can also download this compose file and then deploy their own application stacks for testing or whatever. And it increases the collaborations manifold. Right? So this is how Docker Compose works. Now, if I show you the Docker Compose YAML file, you can see this is the port forwarding part. So WordPress application within the container runs on port 80. And this configuration specifies that the port 80 of the container should be forwarded to port 2200 on this host. So if somebody browses on this host, and if they reach out to the port 2200, they should be able to access the application running in this container at port 80. Okay. All right. So this is Docker Compose. Now, there are many directives that you can use. We just saw only a couple of those. Let's see, Docker Compose. Compose file. So for example, we defined services, right? So we can define many services. You can see here, and the services, there are a lot of configurations. We used, for when running a Docker container, we used, which image should be specified. So image we specified. We specified ports. So to publish the port, right? But there are many things that you can do. For example, you can define at which scale should be running, right? You can specify as which user the container should run, which volumes to mount, and things like that. So you can do a lot of things here. Okay, you can specify what is the host name that you want to provide. So whatever configurations you can provide to a Docker container generally are also available for Docker Compose, right? And then you can also create networks. You can also create volumes, configs, and secrets. On the services, I think there is also build. So you can actually, when you run a Docker Compose, you don't even need to pull a Docker image from the Docker Hub. You can build it locally if you have the source code. Right? So in the Docker Compose, you can specify that I want to bring a front-end application, and this is the image, but build it from this directory. So the source code for that application is here. Build it, create an image with this name, and then use it in my application stack. Right? So you can specify like that. You can even build the complete application. Okay. Now that's all I had for today. I'll take some questions. Please, if you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A window. I'll try to answer them. I see there are a lot of questions on the chat window. but please, I'm not going to look at the chat window. I'm going to answer them from the Q&A window. So if you asked on the chat window, please ask again on the Q&A. So is Docker Compose not installed with Docker Desktop? I don't know. I have not used Docker Desktop. It may be installed, but I'm really not sure. Right? Then there's a question, should we ensure that Compose file format version and Docker engine version match all the time? Yes. Although the Docker Compose versions are forward compatible, that means if you upgrade your Docker version, it can still work with the older Compose file versions, right? Can you explain the port mapping segment? I think I explained it already. How network was set up for the Docker application. So when you bring up an application using Docker Compose will actually create a new network and then connect all the services, all the containers to that network. So that's how it works. What if multiple YAML files are there? You run Docker up command. What will it take first? When you say Docker run or Docker Compose up, it's going to take the file with this name. So there cannot be two files with this name. So it's going to pick this up. If you want to use a different file with Docker Compose up command, you can also say -f and my file name, something like this. And that file, .yaml, for example, that file will be taken. Okay. How to debug Docker Compose YAML. If you get some errors in the YAML file, then first of all, ensure that you don't have any typos. So you are writing the keywords as they should be. And also the indentation. YAML file has a strict indentation. So please follow the indentation guide for the YAML. Can we have environment file per application instead of adding environment variables in Docker Compose file? Yes, you can. So you can pass environment variables as well. Just give me a second. Oh, we are here only. So env file. So you have an env file. So you can write a environment variables in a file and then pass it as env file rather than passing environments like we did. Yeah. Build web app. This web app is the entire folder. Exactly. Yes. How to run Docker Compose in interactive mode? You don't run Docker Compose in interactive mode. If you want to run in interactive mode, you can run the individual containers in interactive mode, right? So you can pass the programmer TTY, right? So that you get a terminal, and then you can attach to it. So you have to explicitly attach to individual containers. You can't attach to the entire Compose. When do we create network within Compose file? It automatically creates a network, but if you want, you can manually create network also. You can specify, apart from services, you can specify networks and then create different networks for yourself, right? And then you can use that network in your services. Are the Docker Compose and Kubernetes same? No, they are not same. Kubernetes is a container orchestration system, which is similar to Docker Swarm. Docker Compose is just a small orchestrator. What would happen when we have multiple Docker Compose files? I answered this question already. How do you ensure compatibility between Dockers, say WordPress and SkillUpRight? So that you have to ensure from the application design point of view. Docker has no way of ensuring that you have compatibility. How to get IP address you are using for WordPress? That is the IP address of the machine, of the host. Because we publish the port of the container, the application is available on the entire host. When we run Docker Compose up, how would it restore data from last run? Because it has stored the data in the MySQL, right? So when you say Docker Compose down, it doesn't delete the container. It just stops the container of the database and even the front end also. When you say Docker Compose up, it brings up the same container. The data is retained. Orchestration is Docker Swarm right here, an open source one. There is no Docker Swarm involved here. It's a single machine application stack. Docker Swarm ensures that you can deploy an application across multiple Docker hosts or Docker machines, same as Kubernetes. How WordPress is communicating with MySQL, we have not mentioned the DB port in WordPress service. So WordPress by default talks on the database MySQL port, which is 3306. If you want to specify something else, then you can, I think you have different environment variable for WordPress as well. Do we need to map the ports in Docker Compose if it is exposed in Docker file? Yes. So in the Docker file, you define which ports are exposed, but if you want to publish it, you have to explicitly do that here. How to install React.js frontend and Node.js. So there are Docker images for Node.js and React.js both. So your application should have capability to take information from an environment file and then connect to it. That's an application design. How do you specify version of image in YAML configuration? So just write your Docker image name, colon, the tag. That should be it. Can we use JSON? Docker Compose generally doesn't work with JSON. It only works with YAML. Yeah, it doesn't work with actually JSON. It works with YAML only. What is the difference between deployment using Docker Compose and Helm chart? These are two different things. They are not doing the same thing. Helm chart is a package manager for your applications. It also takes care of deploying your services, your autoscaler and all, right? Compose is much smaller in scope compared to that. I have a source code which builds using a script file. How to use Docker Compose in that? If you're building using script file, but then you have to bundle it in your image, for that you need to use Docker file. If you use that, you can create your image. Okay. What Docker play a role here for WordPress? Docker is the underlying technology which runs the containers. Don't we need to add both containers to same network? By default, all the containers will be added to the same network unless you create multiple networks and attach your containers to that. Where are the files created in WordPress saved? In the database or in the WordPress container. I have a Python script converted to Docker image. It involves working with local network. How can I configure it? By default, it is taking own network. Yes. So either you connect it to host network. By default, any application in the container connects to the bridge network. If you connect to host network, then I think you can make use of local network information. Is file name should be Docker Compose, or we can rename it as .star.yml. You can have any name, but just explicitly define the file name then. Is the key declared environment fixed? Keys are fixed. Environment variable keys are fixed. Those are defined in the Docker image. Can we call a Docker file in it? Yes, as I said, you can use the build configuration and then call Docker file in that as well. All right, there are so many questions. I don't think I have enough time to answer all of those. But thank you for those questions. I hope you had a good insight of what is Docker Compose, and it gives you a good starting point to start learning on your own. Right? There are a lot of materials available to read around, to refer. A lot of practice you can do. You can go through this entire documentation and make more sense out of it. This documentation also comes with examples, right? So there are, so let's say try Docker Compose. There are some examples here, right? So you can try these examples and make some sense also out of it. Here are the sample apps with Docker Compose. Right, so Apache PHP, Django, we took a look at WordPress, MySQL. So this is an example which I picked up, but there are many other examples as well. Okay, so I hope you had a good time in this session, and thank you for your attention today. I'm going to meet you some other time. Fine. Thank you and bye.